Houston, Texas was a city of contrasts. Towering skyscrapers and sprawling suburban homes coexisted with a pulsating energy that brought together people of all walks of life. Nestled in the heart of the city was Grace Redeemer Ministries, a thriving megachurch that had become a beacon of hope for thousands. The man behind it all was Pastor Jonah Carrington, a charismatic leader with a voice that could calm storms, or so his followers said. Jonah seemed to have it all: a booming congregation, an unshakable faith, and a beautiful wife, Leah, who stood by his side at every service. Leah was the picture of grace, soft-spoken yet confident, with a smile that could light up any room. Together they were Houston's golden couple, admired not just by their church but by the entire community. But no one knew the cracks beneath the surface, not the congregants who hung on to Jonah's every word, not the deacons who trusted him with church decisions, and certainly not the local press, who often showcased them as the perfect example of faith and love. Leah and Jonah's marriage was far from ordinary. A few years into their union, Leah had approached Jonah with an unconventional idea. She loved him, but she felt stifled by the expectations of perfection that came with being a pastor's wife. She wanted to explore freedom, open their marriage. Jonah, though shocked and initially resistant, eventually agreed. He justified it to himself as an act of trust and understanding. If this was what Leah needed to feel fulfilled, he would support her, or so he told himself. But the truth was, Jonah never fully accepted the arrangement. Every time Leah went out on a date or mentioned another man, it ate away at him. He began to resent her independence and the walls she had built around her personal life. Still, he carried on with the charade, putting on a loving facade every Sunday morning. Then there was Elijah, Jonah's twin brother. Elijah was the opposite of Jonah in almost every way. Where Jonah was reserved and deeply spiritual, Elijah was outgoing, wild, and carefree. Despite their differences, the brothers had always shared an unbreakable bond. But even bonds forged in childhood can break under the weight of secrets and betrayal. Unbeknownst to Jonah, Elijah had always been drawn to Leah. At family gatherings, his eyes lingered on her a little too long. His jokes were a little too flirtatious, and Leah, feeling neglected by Jonah's emotional distance, began to notice Elijah in a way she hadn't before. Their stolen glances turned into whispered conversations, and soon something forbidden began to bloom. It was a humid July night when the first threads of Jonah's life began to unravel. He had just wrapped up a late-night counseling session with a troubled congregant and was driving home. The moon hung low in the sky, its silver light casting eerie shadows on the empty streets. Jonah's mind was elsewhere, replaying Leah's unusually cold demeanor from earlier that day. When he pulled into the driveway, the house was dark except for the faint glow of a bedroom window. Jonah's chest tightened. Leah had said she'd be out late with friends, but something felt off. Quietly, he stepped inside, his shoes sinking into the plush carpet as he made his way upstairs. As he reached the bedroom door, he heard it, a soft murmur of voices followed by laughter. His stomach dropped. With a trembling hand, he pushed the door open. There they were, Leah and Elijah tangled together in the sheets, oblivious to Jonah's presence. Time seemed to freeze. Jonah stood rooted to the spot, his heart pounding like a drum. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind, but one drowned out all the others. Betrayal. Pure, unadulterated betrayal. Elijah was the first to notice him. He scrambled to sit up, his face a mask of panic. Leah gasped, clutching the sheets to her chest. "Jonah, I can explain," she began, but her voice wavered. Jonah didn't respond. His eyes darted between his wife and his brother, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the room, the sound of his heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway. Leah and Elijah didn't dare follow him. They were too stunned, too ashamed. Jonah got into his car and drove aimlessly for hours, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just drove, the betrayal sinking deeper into his soul with each passing mile. By the time he returned home, the house was silent. Leah was asleep, or pretending to be, and Elijah was gone. Jonah sat in the living room, staring at the cross hanging on the wall. He had preached forgiveness 1,000 times, but now, faced with the ultimate test, he wasn't sure he had it in him. For weeks, Jonah tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. He preached his sermons, counseled his congregants, and even managed to smile at Leah during church functions. But inside, he was a storm waiting to explode. Every time he looked at Leah, he saw her with Elijah. Every time he prayed, he heard her laughter echoing in his mind. Leah, on the other hand, tried to make amends. She ended her affair with Elijah and begged Jonah to forgive her, but her efforts only seemed to push him further away. He became colder, more distant, and began to spend more time at the church, avoiding her as much as possible. The tension reached its breaking point one fateful night. Jonah came home to find Leah sitting in the living room, a somber expression on her face. "Jonah, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. He didn't respond, just stared at her with hollow eyes. "I'm pregnant," she said finally. For a moment, Jonah felt a flicker of hope. A child could be a fresh start, a chance to rebuild what they had lost. But then the doubts crept in. Was it his or Elijah's? The room fell into an oppressive silence as the weight of her words settled over them. Jonah's hands clenched into fists. The storm inside him was no longer waiting to explode. It was here, ready to consume everything in its path. "I need to know," he said, his voice low and trembling. "Is it mine?" Leah's eyes filled with tears. "Of course it is," she said, but the hesitation in her voice was unmistakable. Jonah stood, his entire body trembling with rage. "You've taken everything from me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My trust, my family, my faith. And now you want me to believe this?" Leah tried to reach for him, but he pulled away. "Jonah, please, don't," he said, his voice sharp and final. "Don't say another word." He stormed out of the house, leaving Leah sobbing in the living room. Outside, the humid Houston air felt suffocating, but Jonah didn't care. He needed to think, to pray, to figure out what to do next. But deep down, he already knew there was no going back. Something had shifted inside him that night, something dark and irreparable, and it was only the beginning. The summer heat in Houston was relentless. The days dragged on, the humidity thick like a suffocating blanket. But in the Carrington household, the atmosphere was even heavier. Weeks passed, and the tension between Jonah and Leah grew unbearable. They spoke in clipped sentences, avoided each other's eyes, and tiptoed around their shared home like strangers. Leah's pregnancy became the elephant in the room. Jonah refused to talk about it, and Leah, sensing his unspoken doubts, stopped trying to convince him. But the more Jonah buried his emotions, the more they festered. Every time he saw Leah's growing belly, his mind whispered the same question. What if it isn't mine? Jonah threw himself into his work at Grace Redeemer Ministries. He began taking on more counseling sessions, more prayer meetings, more late-night services. The church became his sanctuary, the only place where he felt in control. But even there, the whispers of doubt followed him. He began to see Elijah's face in the crowd, even when his brother wasn't there. He imagined the congregation staring at him, judging him, laughing at him. The betrayal had cracked something deep within Jonah. A man who had built his life on trust, faith, and the image of a perfect family. Now that image was shattered, and he didn't know how to put the pieces back together. Leah, for her part, was trying to move forward. She had ended things with Elijah the night Jonah caught them. The affair, while exciting in its secrecy, had been a mistake. A lapse in judgment fueled by loneliness and resentment. She loved Jonah, or at least, she wanted to believe she still did. But Elijah wasn't making it easy. He called her constantly, leaving her voicemails that swung between apologies and declarations of love. She deleted them all, but the guilt lingered. Every time she saw Jonah's face, she was reminded of her betrayal. And now, with the baby growing inside her, she was desperate to salvage what was left of their marriage. One evening, she decided to confront Jonah. She found him in his study, surrounded by stacks of sermon notes and theological books. He was scribbling something in a notebook, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Jonah, we need to talk," Leah said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. He didn't look up. "I'm busy, Leah. Please," she said, stepping closer. "You can't avoid me forever." Jonah sighed and set his pen down. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes cold and distant. "What do you want to talk about?" "The baby," she said, her hand instinctively resting on her belly. Jonah's jaw tightened. "What about it?" "I know you have doubts," Leah said, her voice trembling. "But I need you to trust me. The baby is yours, Jonah. I made a mistake, but this child, it's ours. We can move past this. We can start over." Jonah stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he stood and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening sky. "Do you even hear yourself?" he said, his voice low and bitter. "You want me to just forget everything? To pretend that you didn't destroy our marriage? Our family?" Tears streamed down Leah's face. "I'm not asking you to forget. I'm asking you to forgive. For us, for our child." Jonah turned to face her, his eyes blazing with anger. "Forgive you? How can I forgive you when I can't even look at you without seeing him?" Leah flinched as if he had struck her. "Jonah, please, enough," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "I don't want to hear it anymore. I don't want to hear your excuses, your lies. I don't even know who you are anymore." Leah stood frozen, her sobs silent but violent. Jonah's words cut deeper than any knife. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, she turned and fled the room, her footsteps fading down the hall. Jonah sank into his chair, his head in his hands. The room was silent, save for the ticking of the clock on the wall. He felt a surge of guilt for the way he had spoken to her, but it was quickly overshadowed by the anger that consumed him. He wasn't sure how much more he could take. Elijah, meanwhile, was spiraling in his own way. He had moved out of Houston shortly after the confrontation, hoping to give Jonah and Leah space. But the distance didn't ease his guilt, or his feelings for Leah. He regretted the affair, but he couldn't deny the connection he had felt with her. It was wrong, but it was real. He began drinking heavily, spending his nights in bars and his days nursing hangovers. He ignored calls from his family and avoided church altogether. The weight of his actions was crushing, and he didn't know how to make it right. One night, after one too many drinks, Elijah made a decision. He would go back to Houston and confront Jonah. He couldn't live with the silence anymore. He needed to apologize, to make amends no matter the cost. The storm that had been brewing in the Carrington family was about to reach its breaking point. Jonah's anger, Leah's guilt, and Elijah's desperation were on a collision course, and when the storm finally broke, the consequences would be deadly. The night it happened, the rain was relentless, hammering down on the streets of Houston as if trying to wash away the sins of the city. Jonah sat in the living room, his Bible open on his lap, though he hadn't turned a page in over an hour. His thoughts were elsewhere, dark, chaotic, and dangerous. Leah was upstairs resting. The house was eerily quiet except for the faint sound of thunder rolling in the distance. Jonah's mind raced as he replayed the events of the past few months. His wife's betrayal, his brother's deception, the baby that might not even be his. The rage simmering beneath his calm facade had reached a boiling point. He was lost in thought when the doorbell rang. The sound startled him, and for a moment he debated ignoring it. But then it rang again, louder this time. Jonah stood, his movements slow and deliberate, and made his way to the door. When he opened it, there stood Elijah, soaked to the bone, his face pale and drawn. "Jonah," Elijah began, his voice trembling, "we need to talk." Jonah stared at his twin, his jaw tightening. "There's nothing to talk about. Please," Elijah said, stepping inside uninvited. Water dripped from his clothes onto the hardwood floor, but he didn't seem to notice. "I can't live with this guilt anymore. I need to make things right." Jonah closed the door behind him, his hand lingering on the doorknob. "You think showing up here in the middle of the night is going to fix anything?" "I don't know," Elijah admitted, his eyes pleading, "but I had to try. Jonah, I'm sorry. For everything. I never meant for it to go this far." Jonah let out a bitter laugh. "Never meant for it to go this far? You slept with my wife, Elijah. You destroyed my marriage. Do you even understand what you've done?" "I know," Elijah said, his voice breaking, "and I hate myself for it. But Leah, she was lonely. She felt abandoned. Jonah, and I was weak. I let my feelings get the better of me. But I swear to you it's over. It's been over since that night you found us. Jonah clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. You think I care about your excuses? About your feelings? You betrayed me, Elijah. You, my own brother, betrayed me in the worst way imaginable. I know, Elijah said again, tears streaming down his face. But Jonah, you have to believe me when I say I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. Jonah turned away, his chest heaving as he struggled to contain his emotions. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the steady patter of rain against the windows. Elijah, Jonah said finally, his voice low and dangerous. You need to leave. Now, Jonah, please, leave, Jonah roared, spinning to face him. His eyes burned with fury, and for a moment, Elijah thought he might strike him. Elijah hesitated, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I'll go, he said quietly. But Jonah, I'm begging you. Don't let this destroy you. Don't let it destroy your family. Jonah said nothing, his gaze fixed on the floor. Elijah lingered for a moment longer before turning and walking out into the rain. Upstairs, Leah had heard everything. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she clutched the fabric of her nightgown. She hadn't meant for things to spiral this far out of control. All she had wanted was to feel loved, to feel seen, and now her entire world was falling apart. When Jonah finally came upstairs, his expression was cold and unreadable. He didn't speak as he changed out of his clothes and climbed into bed. Leah wanted to say something, anything to bridge the growing chasm between them, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, they lay side by side in silence, the weight of their unspoken pain pressing down on them like a suffocating fog. The next morning, Jonah woke early. He left the house without a word, driving aimlessly through the city as the sun rose over Houston. He ended up at Grace Redeemer Ministries, sitting alone in the empty sanctuary. He prayed for hours, asking God for guidance, for strength, for clarity. But no answers came. All he felt was the gnawing ache of betrayal and the burning rage that threatened to consume him. When he returned home, the house was quiet. He found Leah in the kitchen, making breakfast. She smiled weakly at him, her swollen belly visible beneath her loose dress. Good morning, she said softly. Jonah didn't respond. He sat at the table, staring at the plate of food she placed in front of him. Jonah, Leah began, her voice hesitant. I know things have been hard, but… Don't, Jonah interrupted, his voice cold. Just don't. Leah flinched, her eyes welling with tears. She turned away, busying herself at the sink to hide her emotions. As Jonah sat there, his mind racing, he made a decision. He couldn't go on like this. Something had to give. And as he clenched his fork in his hand, a dark thought took root in his mind. The storm was far from over. The day it all came crashing down began like any other, a deceptive calm before the storm. The sun rose over Houston, its golden rays cutting through the morning haze. Leah, now 8 months pregnant, went about her day as if it were a normal one, though she felt the tension lingering in the air. Jonah had been quieter than usual, retreating deeper into himself, a shadow of the man she once knew. That morning, Jonah left the house without a word. He didn't say where he was going or when he would be back. Leah tried not to let it bother her, but the silence he left behind was suffocating. She busied herself with small tasks, folding baby clothes, rearranging the nursery, anything to distract herself from the growing pit in her stomach. By the afternoon, the clouds rolled in, thick and heavy. The weather mirrored Leah's emotions, unsettled, brooding, on the verge of breaking. She sat by the window, staring out at the gray sky, lost in thought. She didn't hear the door open or the footsteps approaching. Elijah, she gasped, startled by the sight of him standing in the living room, dripping wet from the rain. I know I shouldn't be here, Elijah said, his voice low, but I needed to see you. Leah stood, her hand instinctively resting on her belly. Elijah, you can't just show up like this. Jonah will… Jonah's not here, Elijah interrupted, stepping closer. I checked. I wouldn't have come if he was. Leah frowned, unease creeping into her chest. Why are you here, Elijah? I wanted to make sure you're okay, he said, his eyes scanning her face. You've been on my mind constantly. I know I've made mistakes, but I can't just walk away and pretend none of this happened. Elijah, you have to leave, Leah said firmly, though her voice wavered. If Jonah finds out you were here… I don't care about Jonah, Elijah said, his voice rising. What about you? What about the baby? Do you really think he's going to forgive you? Do you really think this is going to end well? Leah took a step back, her heart pounding. You need to leave, she repeated, her voice shaking. But before Elijah could respond, the front door swung open with a violent crash. Jonah stood in the doorway, his eyes blazing with fury. What the hell is this? He demanded, his voice like thunder. Leah froze, her breath catching in her throat. Elijah turned to face his brother, his expression a mix of guilt and defiance. Jonah, it's not what you think, Leah began, but Jonah cut her off. Not what I think, he roared, stepping into the room. I come home to find my wife and my brother alone in my house, and you want me to believe it's not what I think? Jonah, calm down, Elijah said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. I came here to talk, that's all. Talk? Jonah spat, his voice dripping with venom. You've done enough talking, Elijah. You've done enough of everything. Get out of my house. Jonah, please. Leah tried again, but he silenced her with a glare. You, Jonah said, pointing at Elijah. Out. Now Elijah hesitated, his gaze flicking between Jonah and Leah. Finally, he nodded and turned to leave. But as he passed Jonah, he paused. For what it's worth, Elijah said quietly. I'm sorry. Jonah didn't respond. He stood still as a statue, his fists clenched at his sides. Once Elijah was gone, Jonah turned to Leah, his eyes cold and unyielding. What were you thinking? He demanded. I didn't know he was coming, Leah said, her voice trembling. He just showed up, Jonah. I told him to leave. You expect me to believe that? Jonah said, his tone laced with disbelief. After everything you've done, you expect me to believe you had nothing to do with this? I swear, Jonah, Leah pleaded, tears streaming down her face. I didn't ask him to come here. I told him to leave. Jonah shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. I can't do this anymore, Leah. I can't live like this. Jonah, please, Leah sobbed. Don't do this. We can fix this. We can get through this. But Jonah wasn't listening. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Leah standing there, her heart shattered. Jonah didn't go far. He paced the backyard, the rain soaking through his clothes as his mind raced. His anger was a living, breathing thing, clawing at him, demanding release. He felt trapped, suffocated by his own thoughts, his own emotions. When he finally returned to the house, he was a man on the edge. Leah was in the bedroom, sitting on the bed with her head in her hands. She didn't hear Jonah come in until he was standing right in front of her. We need to talk, he said, his voice eerily calm. Leah looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. Jonah, I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sorry, he said, a bitter smile playing on his lips. Sorry doesn't fix this, Leah. Sorry doesn't erase what you've done. I know, she said, her voice cracking. But I love you, Jonah. I love you. And I love our baby. Please, can't we move past this? Jonah stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he snapped. What happened next was a blur of rage and violence, a storm that had been building for months, finally unleashed. The house was silent once more, save for the rain pounding against the windows. The Houston Police Department was called to the scene just after midnight. The responding officers, guided by a frantic 911 call from a neighbor, arrived to find the house bathed in blue and red lights. The scene inside was chaotic, officers whispering in hushed tones, paramedics shaking their heads grimly. Leah's body was found sprawled on the bedroom floor, her blood pooling beneath her. Her pale, lifeless form told a story of unimaginable violence. 20 stab wounds marred her torso, a grim testament to the brutal attack. Nearby, Jonah sat on the edge of the bed, his clothes soaked in Leah's blood. His face was expressionless, his hands clasped together as if in prayer. Detective Raymond Grayson arrived at the scene shortly after. A seasoned investigator with over 25 years of experience, Grayson had seen his share of horrors, but even he wasn't prepared for what awaited him inside the house. Grayson approached the bedroom, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. He paused at the doorway, taking in the scene before him. Dear God, he muttered under his breath. The lead officer on the scene, Sergeant Clara Jennings, briefed him quickly. The victim is Leah Monroe, 8 months pregnant, Cause of death appears to be multiple stab wounds. The suspect, her husband Jonah Monroe, was found at the scene. He hasn't said a word since we arrived. Grayson nodded, his sharp eyes scanning the room. And the weapon? We found a bloody kitchen knife on the floor next to the bed, Jennings replied, gesturing to the evidence bag held by a forensic technician. Grayson stepped into the room, careful not to disturb the scene. He crouched down near Leah's body, noting the angle and depth of the wounds. It was clear this wasn't a crime of premeditation. It was an explosion of rage. He turned his attention to Jonah, who hadn't moved since Grayson arrived. The man's eyes were vacant, his expression eerily calm. "Mr. Monroe," Grayson said, his voice steady but firm. "Can you tell me what happened here?" Jonah didn't respond. Grayson tried again. "Jonah, I need you to help me understand. Why is your wife lying dead on the floor? Why are you covered in her blood?" Still, Jonah said nothing. Grayson sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Take him in," he instructed the officers. "We'll see if he's more cooperative at the station." As Jonah was led out in handcuffs, Grayson turned back to Jennings. "Get forensics to process everything. Blood splatter, fingerprints, anything that tells us what happened here. And I want to know more about the Monroes. Background checks, family dynamics, the works." At the station, Jonah was placed in an interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the table. Grayson sat across from him, a cup of coffee in his hand. "Jonah," Grayson began, his tone softer now, "I know you're a pastor, a man of faith, a man who believes in right and wrong. So tell me, what happened tonight?" Jonah stared at the table, silent. Grayson leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You don't strike me as a cold-blooded killer, but I need to hear it from you. Why did you do it?" Finally, Jonah looked up, his eyes locking with Grayson's. "I didn't mean to," he said, his voice barely audible. Grayson's heart skipped a beat. It was the first time Jonah had spoken since the police arrived. "Didn't mean to what?" Grayson pressed gently. "I didn't mean to kill her," Jonah said, his voice trembling. I couldn't stop." "Couldn't stop what, Jonah?" Jonah closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. "She was with him again. I caught them together. In our bed." Grayson felt a chill run down his spine. "You mean your brother, Elijah?" Jonah nodded. Grayson leaned back, letting the weight of Jonah's confession sink in. "Tell me everything," he said. Jonah recounted the events of the night in halting, broken sentences. He had returned home to find Elijah's car parked outside. Suspicious, he had entered the house quietly, his heart pounding in his chest. When he reached the bedroom, he found Leah and Elijah in bed together. The sight of them, the woman he loved and the brother he once trusted, sent him into a blind rage. He remembered grabbing the knife from the kitchen, but after that, everything was a blur. "I just wanted them to stop," Jonah whispered, his voice filled with anguish. "I wanted the pain to stop." Grayson listened carefully, piecing together the fragments of Jonah's story. It was clear that this was a crime of passion, but there were still gaps in the narrative that didn't make sense. Why had Leah allowed Elijah back into the house? And what role had Elijah played in all of this? "Where is Elijah now?" Grayson asked. Jonah shook his head. "I don't know. He left before it happened." Grayson frowned. If Elijah had left before the murder, why had he been at the house in the first place? And why hadn't he come forward? The detective stood, his mind racing. "I think we're going to need a word with your brother." Back at the crime scene, the forensic team uncovered an interesting detail. A second set of footprints, larger than Leah's but different from Jonah's, had been found leading from the bedroom to the front door. Grayson's instincts kicked in. "Elijah was here," he muttered to himself, "and he knows more than he's letting on." The investigation was far from over. Jonah's confession had answered some questions, but it had raised even more. Grayson knew one thing for certain: the truth was buried deep, and he wouldn't stop until he uncovered it. Detective Raymond Grayson arrived at Elijah Monroe's apartment the next morning. The address, pulled from the twins' records, was a modest building in downtown Houston. The complex looked clean and unassuming, with neighbors casually walking their dogs or heading to work, oblivious to the turmoil brewing within their midst. Grayson knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the hallway. After a long pause, Elijah opened it. His face was pale, his hair disheveled, and his eyes carried the weight of a man who hadn't slept. "Elijah Monroe?" Grayson asked, holding up his badge. "Yes," Elijah replied cautiously. "I'm Detective Grayson. I need to ask you a few questions about your brother Jonah and Leah Monroe." Elijah hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I heard what happened," he said finally, stepping aside to let the detective in. The apartment was sparsely decorated, with a couch, a coffee table, and a stack of unopened mail on the counter. Grayson noticed a pair of muddy shoes near the door and made a mental note. "Elijah, let's not waste time," Grayson began, sitting across from him. "You were at Jonah's house last night, weren't you?" Elijah froze. "Who told you that?" Grayson leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "We found your footprints leading out of the house. Jonah confessed to the murder, but his story raises more questions than answers. So I'm asking you, what were you doing there?" Elijah exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Grayson's pulse quickened. "Didn't mean for what to happen?" "Start from the beginning, Elijah." Elijah's shoulders slumped as he began to speak. "Leah and I, it started about 6 months ago. She came to me, upset about Jonah. He was distant, always focused on the church. She felt neglected. One thing led to another and we got involved." Grayson's jaw tightened, but he let Elijah continue. "I know it was wrong," Elijah admitted, his voice breaking. "But I loved her, and she said she loved me too." "Did Jonah know about the affair?" Grayson asked. Elijah nodded. "He found out a month ago. He confronted me at the church, said he'd never forgive me. But Leah convinced him to try an open marriage. She said it was the only way to save their relationship." Grayson's mind churned, trying to make sense of the tangled mess of emotions and decisions that had led to this tragedy. "What happened last night, Elijah? Why were you at their house?" Elijah hesitated, his eyes darting around the room. "She called me," he said finally. "She said Jonah was at a late-night prayer meeting and wouldn't be home. She wanted to talk, to figure out what we were going to do about the baby." Grayson's eyes narrowed. "The baby? You mean, it's mine," Elijah interrupted, his voice cracking. "Leah told me I was the father. Jonah didn't know." Grayson's stomach churned. The layers of betrayal in this case were almost too much to process. "So you went over to talk," Grayson prompted. "Then what?" "We were in the bedroom," Elijah admitted, shame flickering across his face. "Talking, and then Jonah came home. I didn't hear him come in until it was too late. He walked in, saw us together, and just lost it. He started shouting, calling us sinners. I thought he was going to hit me, so I ran. I didn't think he'd kill her." Grayson leaned back, processing the confession. "Why didn't you call the police?" Elijah's face crumpled. "I was scared. I didn't know what to do. I just ran." Grayson stood, his expression unreadable. "Elijah, you're coming with me to the station. We need to sort this out." At the station, Grayson reviewed the evidence with his team. Elijah's story aligned with the physical evidence, but it didn't absolve him. His presence at the scene and his relationship with Leah were significant pieces of the puzzle. As Elijah sat in an interrogation room, Grayson pored over the autopsy report. The pathologist confirmed that Leah had been stabbed 20 times, each wound delivered with immense force. But there was one detail that stood out: defensive wounds on Leah's hands. "She tried to fight him off," Grayson muttered, his stomach tightening. The DNA results from the knife came back shortly after. Jonah's fingerprints were on the handle, but there was also a second set, smaller, likely Leah's. The results confirmed what Grayson had suspected. Leah had tried to grab the knife during the attack. Grayson decided it was time to confront Jonah again. "Jonah," Grayson began, sitting across from him in the interrogation room, "we spoke to your brother. He told us about the affair and the baby." Jonah flinched but said nothing. "We know you walked in on them," Grayson continued. "We know you snapped. But I need you to tell me in your own words what happened." Jonah's hands trembled as he spoke. "I came home early from the prayer meeting. I wanted to surprise Leah with her favorite ice cream. When I walked into the bedroom and saw them together, His voice cracked, and tears streamed down his face. I couldn't control myself. I went to the kitchen, grabbed the knife, and he broke down, sobbing. Grayson watched him silently. The confession was raw and emotional, but it wasn't enough. There was still a nagging question in his mind. Jonah, he said softly, why didn't you stop? Leah tried to defend herself. Why didn't you stop when she begged you to? Jonah's sobs grew louder, but he didn't answer. Grayson left the room, his mind racing. There was more to this story, and he was determined to uncover it. Detective Grayson sat in his office, the weight of the case pressing heavily on him. The pieces of the puzzle were almost complete, yet something still didn't feel right. Jonah's confession, though emotional, lacked the full picture. Elijah's alibi painted him as a desperate lover, but Grayson knew desperation often led to mistakes. Then there was Leah, an ambitious woman caught between two brothers, now silenced forever. Grayson stared at the autopsy report again. Leah had defensive wounds, suggesting a struggle, yet Jonah's claim of a blind rage didn't fully align. Why hadn't she managed to escape, or at least scream for help? Then there was the curious lack of blood splatter on Jonah's clothes when he was arrested, despite the frenzied nature of the attack. Something wasn't adding up. The DNA results from under Leah's fingernails arrived just as Grayson's thoughts spiraled. He opened the report, expecting Jonah's name, but froze when he saw the result. Elijah Monroe. Grayson's stomach tightened. Why would Elijah's DNA be under her nails if he claims he fled before the murder? He muttered. Grayson knew he needed one last round of questioning, but this time he'd press both brothers together. In the small, dimly lit interrogation room, Jonah sat slumped in his chair, eyes bloodshot from crying. Across from him, Elijah sat stiffly, avoiding his twin's gaze. Grayson entered the room and placed the autopsy report and DNA results on the table. Gentlemen, he began, this case has been a tangled web of secrets, lies, and betrayal, but now we're going to unravel it for good. Jonah looked up weakly. I already confessed. What more do you want? Grayson ignored him and turned to Elijah. You told me you left the house when Jonah arrived, correct? Yes, Elijah replied, his voice tight. Grayson slid the DNA report across the table. Then explain how your DNA ended up under Leah's fingernails. Explain why she has fresh bruises on her wrist consistent with someone restraining her. Elijah's face turned pale. I don't know. Maybe it happened earlier. When you fought, Grayson interrupted, his voice sharp. Because it's clear now that you didn't run away like you claimed. Jonah sat up straighter, his confusion turning to suspicion. What is he saying, Elijah? Did you? Elijah's jaw tightened. I told you I loved her. I wasn't going to let you ruin her life any more than you already had. Grayson leaned forward, his voice low and commanding. Tell us what really happened, Elijah. The room was thick with tension as Elijah's facade crumbled. Fine, and he spat. You want the truth? Leah told me she was leaving Jonah for me. She said she couldn't pretend anymore, especially with the baby coming. But when I got there last night, she changed her mind. She said she couldn't destroy the family like that. Jonah's eyes widened in disbelief. You were going to take her from me. She wanted me, Elijah shouted, his face red with anger. But she was scared of what you'd do. She begged me to leave, said she'd figure it out on her own. I lost it. I grabbed her, tried to make her see reason, but she fought back. I didn't mean to hurt her. Grayson's voice was cold. And then Jonah walked in. Elijah nodded, his expression hollow. He saw us struggling. He thought I was attacking her, and he lunged at me. We fought, and I shoved him aside. That's when he saw the knife on the floor. He picked it up, and he went crazy. He stabbed her over and over. I tried to stop him, but I couldn't. Jonah's face was a mask of horror. You're lying. I didn't. Your fingerprints were on the knife, Jonah, Grayson interjected, and Elijah's DNA was under Leah's nails. The evidence points to both of you. I didn't mean to kill her, Jonah suddenly cried. I just wanted her to stop screaming. I didn't know what I was doing. Grayson's voice softened, though his words were firm. You both played a part in Leah's death. Your jealousy, your anger, and your inability to face the truth destroyed her. but it's my job to make sure she gets justice. In the days that followed, both brothers were charged with Leah's murder. Jonah faced charges for the actual killing, while Elijah was charged with assault and conspiracy. The media erupted with headlines about the scandal. The once revered pastor now disgraced, and his brother exposed as a deceitful lover. Grayson watched the news from his office, the weight of the case still heavy on his shoulders. Justice had been served, but it was a hollow victory. Leah Monroe, a woman caught in a storm of passion and betrayal, was gone. Her child, an innocent life, never had a chance to see the world. Grayson sighed and turned off the TV. For all the darkness he'd uncovered, he knew one thing for certain. No secret stayed buried forever. And in the end, the truth always found a way to surface.